March 25, 1986. The rugged mountains of Paktia Province, Afghanistan. Commander Abdul Qadir gripped the unfamiliar American weapon, its weight both reassuring and terrifying in his calloused hands. For 6 years, Soviet Mi-24 Hind gunships had ruled Afghanistan's skies with impunity, their armor seemingly impervious to everything the Mujahideen possessed. What Qadir and his fighters didn't know was that the FIM-92 Stinger missile resting on his shoulder would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the Soviet-Afghan War. The psychological impact of this weapon would prove as devastating as its explosive power, shattering Soviet assumptions about air superiority and forcing a complete reassessment of their entire counterinsurgency strategy. The story of how a shoulder-fired missile system changed the course of a superpower conflict begins not in Afghanistan's mountains, but in the classified briefing rooms of Washington, D.C., where CIA officers and Pentagon planners debated whether arming Islamic guerrillas with advanced American weapons was worth the strategic risk. It was a decision that would have consequences far beyond the immediate conflict, rippling through decades of geopolitical history. In early 1980, when Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan to prop up the failing communist government in Kabul, American policymakers faced a dilemma that would define Cold War proxy warfare. The Soviet 40th Army, equipped with modern armor, artillery, and most critically, attack helicopters, was systematically crushing resistance in Afghanistan's villages and mountain passes. The Mujahideen, fragmented into dozens of competing factions, possessed courage and intimate knowledge of their homeland's terrain, but lacked any effective means of challenging Soviet air power. The Mi-24 Hind represented Soviet military aviation at its most formidable. Designed as a flying infantry fighting vehicle, the Hind combined heavy armor protection with devastating firepower. Its titanium-reinforced cockpit could withstand 12.7 mm machine gun fire. Its stub wings carried up to 1,500 kilograms of ordnance, rockets, bombs, and anti-tank missiles. Most terrifyingly for ground forces, its turret-mounted 4-barrel Yakashev-Borzov Yakbi 12.7 mm Gatling gun could deliver 4,500 rounds per minute of suppressive fire. By 1982, Soviet tactics in Afghanistan had evolved into a brutal pattern of search-and-destroy operations. Hinds would arrive at dawn, circling villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Their psychological impact was immense. The distinctive sound of their twin Isotov turboshaft engines became synonymous with death. Villagers who heard that sound had minutes, sometimes seconds, to flee before rockets and cannon fire turned their homes into rubble. The Mujahideen fought back with everything they possessed. DSHK heavy machine guns, captured from Soviet convoys or supplied by sympathetic Arab states, could damage Hinds if they scored hits on vulnerable areas. But the heavy weapons were difficult to maneuver in mountainous terrain, and their tracers revealed shooter positions, inviting devastating return fire. The Soviet pilots quickly learned to stay above 3,000 meters when possible, beyond the effective range of small arms and light machine guns, descending only for attack runs executed with brutal efficiency. RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenades, ubiquitous in guerrilla arsenals worldwide, proved almost worthless against helicopters. The unguided rockets required impossible leading calculations against fast-moving aerial targets. In 6 years of conflict, successful RPG hits on helicopters were so rare that each instance became legendary, stories told and retold in Mujahideen camps. The psychological damage of facing unchallengeable air power was severe. Commanders watched helplessly as Soviet helicopters destroyed their supply convoys, attacked their camps, and provided overwhelming support to ground operations. The CIA's initial response to Soviet intervention in Afghanistan was measured and cautious. Operation Cyclone, as the covert support program was codenamed, began in 1980 with modest funding of approximately $20 million annually. The agency provided non-American weapons to maintain plausible deniability. Chinese-manufactured Kalashnikovs, Egyptian ammunition, Swiss Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons, captured from Palestinians. The goal was to make the Soviet occupation costly, not to decisively defeat the 40th Army. This calculated approach had political logic. Direct American military involvement risked escalating the Cold War confrontation dangerously. Providing distinctive American weapons would compromise deniability and potentially trigger Soviet retaliation elsewhere. Most critically, there were genuine fears that advanced weapons supplied to Islamic guerrillas might eventually be used against American interests. These concerns would prove prophetic decades later, but in 1980, the immediate calculation favored caution. However, as the war dragged through its second and third years, Soviet tactics became increasingly effective. The introduction of coordinated helicopter ground assault tactics in 1982 allowed Soviet forces to seal off resistant strongholds and methodically destroy them. The Panjshir Valley offensives, conducted with massive helicopter support, demonstrated that Soviet forces were learning and adapting. Without some means of challenging air superiority, the Mujahideen faced potential defeat through systematic attrition. The weapon that would change this calculus had been in American military service since 1981. The FIM-92 Stinger represented the culmination of decades of research into man-portable air defense systems. Its development history was troubled. Early versions suffered from reliability problems and struggled to acquire targets against ground clutter. The Stinger Post version, introduced in 1983, incorporated critical improvements. A rosette-scanning infrared seeker that could distinguish aircraft heat signatures from background thermal noise, an identification friend or foe system to prevent fratricide, and a proportional navigation system that dramatically improved hit probability. The missile itself was elegantly simple in concept but sophisticated in execution. Weighing 10.1 kilograms, complete with launch tube, it could be carried and operated by a single soldier. The infrared seeker passively tracked heat signatures, making it immune to radar jamming. Once launched, the missile accelerated to Mach 2.2, guided by proportional navigation that predicted target position and adjusted trajectory continuously. The 3-kilogram high-explosive warhead was designed to destroy aircraft through a combination of blast effect and fragmentation, targeting engines and critical systems. In American service, the Stinger equipped air defense battalions and special operations forces. Its combat debut in the 1983 Grenada invasion was limited. The weapon's true potential remained largely theoretical. It had never been employed against a sophisticated air force operating advanced attack helicopters in realistic combat conditions. Afghanistan would provide that test, though the decision to conduct it was agonizingly difficult and bitterly contested within the American government. The debate over providing Stingers to the Mujahideen consumed months of classified meetings. Throughout 1985, the CIA's Directorate of Operations advocated strongly for the transfer. Officers familiar with conditions in Afghanistan argued that without an effective anti-aircraft capability, the resistance faced strategic defeat. Soviet helicopter tactics were becoming devastatingly effective, and Mujahideen morale was eroding. The Pentagon and State Department raised serious objections. The Stinger represented current American military technology. Its infrared seeker and guidance systems were classified. If even one missile fell into Soviet hands intact, reverse engineering might compromise the weapon's effectiveness against Soviet air forces elsewhere. Worse, the missiles might proliferate to terrorist organizations or hostile states, potentially threatening civilian aviation. The specter of a Stinger-armed terrorist shooting down a commercial airliner was invoked repeatedly in classified threat assessments. The debate reached President Ronald Reagan's desk in October 1985. Reagan, who had made rolling back Soviet influence a cornerstone of his foreign policy, sided with the CIA. His decision was documented in National Security Decision Directive 166, which authorized a dramatic escalation of American support for the Afghan resistance. The specific authorization to provide Stinger missiles was classified, but the strategic intent was clear. The Soviet occupation must be made prohibitively expensive. The operational security surrounding the transfer was unprecedented. The CIA established elaborate procedures to track every missile. Each Stinger was individually serialized. Mujahideen commanders who received the weapon signed receipts and were required to return expended launch tubes to prove the missiles had been fired rather than sold or captured. The agency retained plausible deniability by providing the weapons through Pakistani intelligence, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, which had been the primary conduit for American aid throughout the war. The first shipment of Stinger missiles arrived in Pakistan in February 1986. The initial allocation was modest, approximately 250 missiles and 40 gripstock launchers. CIA officers worked with ISI counterparts to identify Mujahideen fighters who would receive training. The selection criteria were strict. Fighters needed to demonstrate loyalty, intelligence, and discretion. The training program, conducted at secure facilities near Rawalpindi, Pakistan, took several weeks and covered missile operation, target identification, engagement procedures, and, critically, operational security. The instructors, American Special Forces personnel officially on temporary duty with the CIA, emphasized repeatedly that the Stingers were not magical weapons. Successful employment required discipline and tactical understanding. Shooters needed to position themselves where helicopters would pass within range, approximately 4,500 meters maximum effective distance. They needed to remain concealed until the optimal moment, as firing revealed their position. They needed to understand the missile's limitations. It could not engage targets flying below 60 meters altitude due to ground clutter interference, and it required several seconds of tracking time before achieving lock-on. The psychological preparation was as important as technical training. The instructors, some of whom had combat experience in Vietnam, understood that soldiers facing overwhelming enemy firepower often felt helpless. The Stinger represented hope, but employing it successfully required overcoming deeply ingrained instincts to hide when helicopters appeared. Shooters needed to expose themselves deliberately, standing upright to acquire targets, while those aircraft circled overhead looking for exactly such targets. This required courage that technical training alone could not provide. The first combat employment of Stinger missiles by Mujahideen forces occurred on September 26, 1986, near Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan. 3 Mujahideen fighters from Yunus Khalis, Hezb-e Islami faction, armed with newly delivered Stingers, positioned themselves along a known Soviet helicopter route. The operation had been planned meticulously. Scouts had observed the pattern of Soviet Mi-24 patrols for weeks, noting that the helicopters typically flew at mid-altitude along the valley, confident in their invulnerability. At approximately 4 p.m., 3 Hinds appeared, flying in formation at roughly 3,000 meters altitude. The Mujahideen waited until the helicopters passed overhead and began descending toward a Soviet base. This was the ideal engagement scenario the CIA instructors had emphasized. Targets moving at reduced speed, presenting their hot engine exhausts within effective range. The lead Stinger operator, identified in Mujahideen accounts as Engineer Gaffer, though his true identity remains uncertain, shouldered the gripstock and activated the seeker. The distinctive tone indicating infrared lock-on sounded within seconds. He squeezed the trigger. The launch motor ignited with a powerful blast, and the missile leapt from the tube, accelerating instantly to supersonic speed. The flight time was less than 3 seconds. The Soviet pilot likely never saw the missile. The Stinger's warhead detonated in proximity to the Hinds engine compartment. The explosion was not immediately catastrophic. The helicopter didn't explode dramatically or disintegrate. Instead, it staggered in the air, black smoke pouring from its damaged engine. The pilot attempted to maintain control, lowering the collective to auto-rotate toward emergency landing sites, but the damage was too severe. The Hind impacted the mountainside at high speed. There were no survivors. The remaining 2 helicopters immediately took evasive action, dispensing flares and diving for terrain masking. A second Stinger was fired but failed to achieve lock-on, possibly confused by flares. The Soviet helicopters retreated at maximum speed, abandoning their patrol route. For the Mujahideen fighters who witnessed the engagement, the psychological impact was profound. For 6 years, they had watched Soviet helicopters operate with impunity. Now they had destroyed one. The wreckage, burning on the mountainside, provided tangible proof that the Hinds were vulnerable. Word spread through resistance networks with remarkable speed. Within days, fighters across Afghanistan knew that the Americans had provided weapons that could kill helicopters. The Soviet reaction combined shock, alarm, and immediate tactical adaptation. The loss of a Hind to what appeared to be a sophisticated surface-to-air missile represented a fundamental change in the threat environment. Soviet intelligence had warned that American Stingers might be provided to the resistance, but the actual deployment triggered urgent reassessment of aviation tactics. Soviet pilots received immediate briefings on the Stinger threat. The intelligence was incomplete. Soviet analysts correctly identified the weapon as an infrared-guided missile, but initially overestimated its maximum altitude capability and underestimated its resistance to flare countermeasures. This led to tactical recommendations that proved only partially effective. Soviet helicopter operations shifted immediately to higher altitudes, typically above 4,000 meters when possible. This reduced exposure to Stinger engagement, but also reduced effectiveness against ground targets. Pilots flying at such altitudes could not identify individual fighters or provide precise fire support. Attack runs required steep diving approaches that increased vulnerability during descent and climb out. Flare dispensers, previously used sparingly, became standard procedure. Soviet helicopters began dispensing flares continuously when operating in hostile areas, creating spectacular but wasteful pyrotechnic displays. The flares provided some protection, but the Stinger Post's Rosette scanner was specifically designed to discriminate between aircraft heat signatures and countermeasure flares. Hit probability was reduced but not eliminated. Most significantly, Soviet aviation operations became more cautious and conservative. Pilots who had previously loitered over suspected Mujahideen positions, suppressing resistance with sustained fire, now made brief high-speed passes and departed immediately. The psychological advantage had shifted. Soviet aircrews, who had operated with confidence, now flew with constant awareness that unseen enemies below might be tracking them through infrared sights. The number of Stinger missiles employed in Afghanistan remains disputed, with various sources providing conflicting figures. CIA documents declassified decades later suggest approximately 500 missiles were transferred through 1987, with additional shipments in 1988 bringing the total to roughly 900 to 1,000 missiles. Not all arrived at Afghanistan. Some were diverted by Pakistani intelligence to favored factions. Others were stockpiled for future use. The number actually fired in combat was significantly lower, perhaps 350 to 400 missiles total throughout the war. However, the strategic impact far exceeded the number of missiles fired. The presence of Stingers fundamentally altered Soviet operational planning and pilot behavior. Every helicopter mission now carried significant risk. Soviet aviation losses, which had averaged approximately 3 to 4 helicopters monthly throughout 1983 to 1985, increased to 8 to 10 monthly in late 1986 and early 1987. More critically, helicopter effectiveness decreased dramatically as pilots operated at higher altitudes with reduced loiter time. The tactical applications of Stingers by Mujahideen forces demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the weapon's capabilities and limitations. Commanders learned to position Stinger teams along known helicopter routes, particularly near Soviet bases, where aircraft descended for landing. The final approach to airfields, when helicopters flew slowly at reduced altitude, provided ideal engagement opportunities. Several Soviet helicopters were destroyed within sight of their own bases, devastating blows to aircrew morale. Convoy protection operations became especially dangerous for Soviet aviation. When Mujahideen forces ambushed supply convoys, Soviet doctrine called for immediate helicopter support to suppress the ambush and protect the vehicles. But Stinger-equipped resistance fighters began specifically targeting the relief helicopters, turning the Soviet response into a trap. Pilots faced impossible choices: provide close support and risk Stinger engagement, or maintain safe altitude and watch ground forces take casualties. The Battle of Jaji in April 1987 illustrated the changed tactical environment. When Soviet and Afghan government forces attempted to destroy a major Mujahideen base in Paktia province, they deployed substantial aviation support, including Mi-24 Hinds and Mi-8 transport helicopters. Mujahideen forces, including a contingent of Arab volunteers led by a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, possessed multiple Stinger missiles. The Soviet helicopter operations were constrained by Stinger threat throughout the engagement. Pilots maintained high altitude and dispensed flares continuously. Attack runs were brief and often ineffective. At least 3 helicopters were damaged by Stinger hits, though only one was destroyed. The Soviet forces eventually overran the Mujahideen positions, but the operation took far longer and cost more casualties than planned. The after-action assessments noted explicitly that fear of Stinger missiles had compromised aviation effectiveness. The broader strategic impact of Stinger deployment became apparent in 1987 as Soviet leadership in Moscow reassessed their entire Afghan strategy. The war was costing approximately $3 to $4 billion annually in direct military expenditure, with thousands of Soviet soldiers killed and many more wounded. The conflict showed no signs of resolution. Soviet forces controlled major cities and key roads, but the countryside remained contested. The introduction of American Stingers, combined with increasing quantities of other advanced weapons, including British blowpipe missiles and Swiss Oerlikon cannons, suggested the resistance was becoming more capable rather than weaker. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had become General Secretary in 1985, was pursuing glasnost and perestroika reforms that required reducing military spending and improving relations with the West. The Afghan War undermined both objectives. It drained resources desperately needed for domestic reforms and poisoned relations with Western governments increasingly critical of Soviet actions. The correlation between Stinger deployment and increased Soviet casualties provided ammunition to advocates for withdrawal. The decision to withdraw Soviet forces from Afghanistan was announced in February 1988, with the process to be completed by February 1989. While multiple factors influenced this decision, including domestic political considerations and the broader Soviet economic crisis, the military leadership's assessment that victory was unattainable at acceptable cost was critical. Soviet generals specifically cited the inability to suppress resistance through air power as a major factor in their strategic pessimism. The Stinger, though just one weapon system among many factors, had contributed meaningfully to that military assessment. The final Soviet withdrawal occurred on February 15, 1989, when the last Soviet units crossed the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan. The 40th Army had suffered approximately 15,000 killed and 53,000 wounded over 9 years. Soviet aviation losses totaled approximately 330 helicopters and 120 fixed-wing aircraft, though exact figures remain disputed. Not all helicopter losses were attributable to Stingers. Many fell to other causes, but the psychological impact of the missile had forced operational changes that reduced Soviet aviation effectiveness across the board. The aftermath of Stinger deployment in Afghanistan validated both the advocates' hopes and critics' fears. The weapon had proven devastatingly effective, contributing to Soviet withdrawal, but the proliferation consequences were severe. Despite CIA tracking efforts, numerous missiles disappeared into the gray arms market. Some were recovered years later in conflict zones worldwide. The fear that terrorists might use Stingers against civilian aircraft led to massive expenditures on airport security and aircraft countermeasures. The CIA conducted a buyback program in the 1990s, offering $100,000 per missile to Afghan commanders willing to return them. The program recovered perhaps 100 to 200 missiles, a fraction of those delivered. Many others were presumably expended in Afghanistan's subsequent civil wars or retained by various factions as insurance against future threats. The successful proliferation of Stinger technology prompted other nations to develop similar systems, creating a global market in man-portable air defense systems that continues threatening aviation security. The lessons learned from Stinger employment in Afghanistan influenced military doctrine across numerous nations. The American military studied Mujahideen tactics extensively, incorporating lessons about man-portable air defense employment into training for special operations forces. The Soviet military, and later the Russian military that succeeded it, fundamentally redesigned helicopter tactics based on Afghan experience. Modern Russian attack helicopters incorporate extensive countermeasures specifically designed to defeat infrared-guided missiles like the Stinger. The psychological dimension of the Stinger's impact deserves particular emphasis. Beyond its technical capabilities, The weapon transformed Mujahideen perception of the conflict from hopeless resistance against overwhelming force to winnable struggle against vulnerable enemy. This psychological shift influenced recruitment, morale, and tactical aggressiveness throughout the resistance. Similarly, the Soviet perception shifted from confidence in eventual victory through superior firepower to recognition that the war was unwinnable at acceptable cost. These psychological changes, enabled but not entirely caused by one weapon system, proved strategically decisive. The enduring controversy over whether providing Stingers to Afghan resistance fighters was wise policy continues among historians and policymakers. Advocates point to the weapon's role in forcing Soviet withdrawal, which they argue hastened the end of the Cold War and Soviet collapse. Critics note the proliferation consequences and the irony that some fighters trained and equipped by the CIA later became adversaries of the United States, using knowledge and occasionally weapons provided during the Soviet-Afghan War against American interests. What remains undisputed is that the Stinger missile fundamentally altered the tactical and strategic calculus of the Soviet-Afghan War. September 26, 1986, when engineer Gaffer's Stinger struck that first Hind near Jalalabad, marked a genuine turning point in the psychological balance of the conflict. Soviet pilots who had operated with confidence learned that Afghan skies were no longer safe. Mujahideen fighters who had felt helpless against air power gained meaningful confidence from knowing they possessed weapons that could destroy helicopters. This shift in tactical psychology, enabled by tungsten-tipped missiles manufactured in American factories and delivered through clandestine CIA channels, influenced every subsequent operation of the Soviet-Afghan War. The Stinger, though never available in unlimited quantities, provided enough capability to transform Mujahideen forces from defensive guerrillas into offensive fighters willing to engage Soviet forces directly. The commanders who fired those first Stingers in combat, watching American missiles streak through Afghan skies to destroy Soviet helicopters, demonstrated that advanced weapons technology, applied intelligently to urgent tactical problems and delivered to motivated forces, could overcome seemingly insurmountable military disadvantages. This fundamental lesson, learned at considerable cost in Afghanistan's mountains, remains directly relevant for understanding modern asymmetric warfare and the enduring challenges of proxy conflicts in great power competition.